Hello everyone, welcome back. Let us discuss about swaps in this session. A swap is a derivative contract through which two parties exchange their cash flows. Swaps do not trade on exchanges, and retail investors do not generally engage in swaps. Rather, swaps are over the counter contracts primarily between businesses or financial institutions that are customized to the needs of both parties. Let us begin with equity swaps. Imagine we have two parties, investor A and B. So here's the situation. Investor A wants to earn returns linked to Tata Motors stock without buying the stock. Whereas investor B owns the shares of Tata Motors but worries the stock price might fall soon. So to address their needs, they agree to enter into an equity swap contract for a notional principal amount of rupees 50 lakhs. Now, please keep in mind that this is just a reference amount and no actual amount of rupees 50 lakh is exchanged. And here's what they agree on. So, investor A will pay investor B a floating interest rate of LIBOR plus 1% per year. For simplicity, let's assume LIBOR is currently 3%. So, the total floating rate is 4% annually. Investor B will pay investor A cash flows based on the total returns of Tata Motors stock, which includes the price changes of the stock and the dividends paid during the period. The swap will last for 1 year and payments will be made at the end of the year. Now, let's fast forward to the end of the year and see what happens. So, at the beginning of the year, Tata Motors stock price was rupees 100 per share. By the end of the year, the stock price increased to rupees 110 per share. Tata Motors also paid a dividend of rupees 2 per share during the year. So this means the total returns of the stock for the year is price change plus dividend equals 110 minus 100 plus 2 divided by 100, which gives us 12%. Now let's calculate the payments for each party. So investor A owes investor B a floating interest payment of 4% on the notional principal of rupees 50 lakhs. So payment from investor A to investor B will be 50 lakhs into 4%, which is 2 lakh rupees. So investor A will pay rupees 2 lakhs to investor B. Next, the investor B owes investor A based on the total returns of Tata Motors stock, which is 12% of the notional principal of 50 lakh rupees. So payment from investor B to investor A will be 50 lakhs into 12%, which gives us 6 lakhs. So investor B will pay rupees 6 lakhs to investor A. At the end of the year, we calculate the net payment. So investor A owes investor B rupees 2 lakhs. Investor B owes investor A rupees 6 lakhs. This means investor B pays investor A rupees 4 lakhs at the end of the year. This is called as netting. Now, let us look at another scenario where the stock price drops to rupees 90 by the end of the year. Tata Motors still pays a dividend of rupees 2 per share during the year. So the total returns of the stock now is price change plus dividend, which equals 90 minus 100 plus 2 divided by 100 gives us negative 8%. This means the stock had a negative return of minus 8% for the year. Investor A owes investor B the floating interest rate of 4% on 550 lakhs, which gives us 2 lakh rupees. Investor B owes investor A cash flows based on the total returns of negative 8% on the 50 lakh, which is negative 4 lakhs. A negative result here means investor B receives rupees 4 lakh from investor A. So to calculate the net payment, we combine these two. That is, the investor A owes investor B rupees 2 lakhs in floating rate payments. Investor B effectively receives an additional 4 lakh due to the negative returns. Thus, in total, investor A pays investor B rupees 6 lakhs. So why rupees 6 lakhs? Investor A replicates a stock's performance. Since the stock's return is negative, investor A compensates investor B for the loss on the notional principal. Additionally, investor A still owes the agreed floating interest payment. So who gains here? Investor A bears the full downside risk of the stock's performance and pay floating interest rate on top of it. Investor B wins. He successfully hedged his stock positions and received rupees 6 lakhs to offset the stock's poor performance. So here's a key takeaway. Equity swaps allow a party to earn equity like returns without owning the stock. The other party can hedge their risk by exchanging their stock's returns for a fixed or a floating payment. Payments are based on the notional principal, which is never exchanged. Only the net difference is paid at the settlement. Now, let us move on to interest rate swaps. Interest rate swaps provide a way for businesses to hedge their exposure to changes in interest rates. If a company believes long term interest rates are likely to rise, it can hedge its exposure to interest rate changes by exchanging its floating rate payments for fixed interest payments. An interest rate swap is an agreement between two parties to exchange one stream of interest payment for another over a set period of time. The most common type of interest rate swap is vanilla swap, in which party A agrees to make payments to party B based on a fixed interest rate, and party B agrees to make payments to party A based on a floating interest rate on a notional principle. The floating rate is tied to a reference rate, in almost all cases, the London Interbank Offer Rate or LIBOR, or SOFR, which is the Secured Overnight Financing Rate. SOFR replaced LIBOR in June 2023. Now, let's see how a speculator can profit from this. Imagine Mr. A believes that interest rates will rise in the future. So, to profit from this, he enters into an interest rate swap agreement where he agrees to pay a fixed rate and receive a floating rate. So, here is why this works. When interest rates rise, the floating rate increases. Since Mr. A receives a floating rate, his payments from the swap also increase. At the same time, his obligation to pay the fixed rate stays constant. So the difference between the higher floating rate he receives and the fixed rate he pays results in a profit. For example, let's assume the notional principal is rupees 10 lakhs. The fixed rate is 4% and the floating rate starts at 3% but rises to 5%. At the end of the period, Mr. A's fixed payment is rupees 40,000, calculated as 4% of the notional principal. However, the floating payment he receives is rupees 50,000 based on the new 5% floating rate. After offsetting these amounts, Mr. A makes a net profit of rupees 10,000. So this shows how Mr. A can benefit from his prediction of rising interest rates. On the other hand, consider Mr. B, who believes that interest rates will fall. He enters into a swap agreement where he agrees to pay a floating rate and receive a fixed rate. This strategy works because when interest rates fall, the floating rate decreases. Mr. B's floating rate payment shrinks while he still receives a higher fixed rate. So the difference between the fixed rate he receives and the lower floating rate he pays results in a profit. For example, with the same notional principal of rupees 10 lakhs, let's assume the fixed rate is 4% and the floating rate starts at 3% but drops to 2%. So at the end of the period, Mr. B receives rupees 40,000 from the fixed rate while paying only rupees 20,000 based on the new lower floating rate. So this results in a net profit of rupees 20,000 for Mr. B. So in short, if you expect interest rates to rise, you want to pay a fixed rate and receive a floating rate. If you expect interest rates to fall, you want to pay a floating rate and receive a fixed rate. So speculators use these strategies to profit from their predictions about interest rate movements. However, it is important to note that this comes with risk. If their predictions are wrong, they could lose money instead of making a profit. Now, let us see how people also use swaps for hedging purposes. Let's say company X can borrow money from Citibank at either a fixed interest rate of 5% or a floating rate of LIBOR plus 0.1%. Similarly, company Y can borrow money from HDFC Bank at a fixed rate of 6.4% or a floating rate of LIBOR plus 0.6%. Company X prefers a floating interest rate, while company Y prefers a fixed interest rate. Design a swap agreement where a swap bank acts as a middleman, earns 0.1% per year for facilitating the deal, and ensures the arrangement is fair and beneficial for both company X and Y. Now, if you observe the situation, company X is better at borrowing at a fixed interest rate, but wants a floating rate. Company Y is better at borrowing at a floating rate, but needs a fixed rate. So, this creates an opportunity for both to enter a swap agreement. So, let's calculate the potential benefits of this arrangement. So, the difference in the fixed rate between the two companies is 1.4% per year, calculated as 6.4% minus 5%. So, the difference in floating rates is 0.5% per year, calculated as LIBOR plus 0.6% minus LIBOR plus 0.1%. So, the total potential benefit of the swap is a fixed rate difference minus the floating rate difference, which is 1.4% minus 0.5%, gives us 0.9% per year. The bank facilitating the swap takes 0.1% as a fee, leaving 0.8% to be shared equally between the two companies. So each company gains a benefit of 0.4% per year. Now, let's see how the swap affects each company's borrowing costs. Without the swap, company X would borrow at a floating rate of LIBOR plus 0.1%. Whereas with the swap, X saves 0.4%, resulting in an effective floating rate of LIBOR minus 0.3%. In case of company Y, without the swap, company Y would borrow at a fixed rate of 6.4%. Whereas with the swap, Y saves 0.4%, resulting in an effective fixed rate of 6%. So here is how the swap works in practice. Company X pays a fixed rate of 5% to its bank, which is offset by receiving the same amount from the swap bank. Company X then pays LIBOR minus 0.3% to the swap bank, achieving its desired floating rate. Alternatively, this can be viewed as X receiving 5.3% from the swap bank and paying LIBOR to net out the same effect. Let's move on to Company Y. Company Y pays a floating rate of LIBOR plus 0.6% to its bank, which is offset by receiving the same amount from the swap bank. Company Y then pays 6% to the swap bank, achieving its desired fixed rate. Alternatively, this can be viewed as Y paying LIBOR and receiving 5.4% from the swap bank. This arrangement ensures that both companies achieve their preferred borrowing terms while sharing the benefits of the swap. Now, let us now move on to discuss about the currency swaps. Currency swaps are widely used by Indian companies to manage exchange rate risks and reduce their borrowing costs. Let's consider an Indian pharmaceutical company like Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, which earns a significant portion of its revenue in the US dollar but incurs most of its cost in Indian rupees. At the same time, a US based healthcare equipment manufacturer might need Indian rupees to expand its operations in India. So these two companies can enter into a currency swap to meet their respective currency needs. Dr. Reddy's might agree to provide rupees 80 crores to the US company, while the US company provides $10 million, assuming an exchange rate of rupees 80 per dollar. At the start of the agreement, they exchange these principal amounts. Over the swap period, Dr. Reddy's will pay interest in dollars on the $10 million it receives, while the US company will pay interest in rupees on the rupees 80 crores it receives. So, this arrangement allows both companies to access the currencies they require without directly borrowing in foreign markets. At the end of the swap agreement, the two companies re-exchange the principal amounts at the same exchange rate of rupees 80 per dollar, ensuring no exchange rate risk. So for Dr. Reddy's, this structure protects against rupee dollar fluctuations, stabilizing its cash flows. For the US company, the swap provides a cost effective way to fund its Indian operations. So, such arrangements showcase how currency swaps can help Indian companies manage currency risk, access foreign capital efficiently, and maintain financial stability. So, that's all for this session. I hope you now have a clear understanding of equity, interest rate, and currency swaps. Thank you.